The French Empire has not ended. Yes, you heard me correctly. Although the history books teach that it ended in 1870, and they're not technically wrong, what many fail to realize is that France is bigger than it may seem, and the empire still lives on, just in other ways. Sure, the France of today is just this piece of land in Europe, but they still maintain an insane level of control over many of its former colonies. France's sphere of influence extends across virtually the entire globe, and the country has perfected a highly sophisticated way of keeping an iron grip on its old territories. But to understand how, though, we need to rewind a couple of centuries back and talk about the official French Empire. While France had colonies going all the way back to the 16th century, its real territorial expansion started with the establishment of the so-called Second French Empire in the 1800s, spanning almost every continent: Europe, Asia, Africa, and the Americas. The empire really kicked off in 1830 with the invasion of Algiers, having a particularly laser-focused obsession with Africa, and eventually grew to a huge network of colonies in the Pacific Islands, Indochina, and the Middle East as well. These colonies were exploited by France as an abundant source of raw materials, labor power, and farmland. And as you might guess, the situation could get quite bloody when these colonies didn't cooperate with their foreign overseers. The French Empire committed numerous atrocities and mass killings in its territorial holdings. Just in Algeria alone, for example, over 300,000 people were killed. So, not so shockingly, most of these colonies were not very happy with this arrangement. And France's centuries-long colonial empire finally began to fall during World War II, when various parts of their overseas colonies were occupied by foreign powers, such as Japan in Indochina, Britain in Syria, Italy in Tunisia, etc. Control was eventually established again after the overseas colonies helped liberate France, as 300,000 North African Arabs fought in the ranks of the Free French. However, then leader Charles de Gaulle had no intention of liberating these countries in return, but rather clamped down on them even more, which set the stage for violent decolonization movements through the 1950s and 60s. And by the 1980s, France's colonial empire was basically dead. So what's the link between all this and France now? The empire is over, right? Well, not exactly. While France officially has no control over all the countries that gained independence, it has its ways of keeping its old colonies under its thumb. The first method that France uses to maintain power over its former territories is monetary policy. See, while the French government basically had no choice but to give up legal ownership over the colonies, it wasn't willing to surrender control completely, and the easiest way to maintain its power was through the CFA franc. Set up in 1945, the CFA franc was essentially a colonial currency to unify the monetary systems in all of France's West African colonies. The currency is completely controlled by France, effectively making all trade in the African colonies dependent on the French government. And if you think a colonial currency would obviously end with independence, you'd be mistaken. The CFA franc continues to be used in 14 African countries to this day, and the French treasury still controls the currency, meaning that those 14 countries use a currency established and run by France. But it gets even crazier. As part of the agreement to use the CFA currency, these 14 countries have to keep 70% of their monetary reserves in the French treasury. In practice, that means all the West African countries that use France's currency only have access to 30% of their own money. The rest is supposedly kept safe by France's own financial institutions. And to rub salt into the wound further, the CFA franc is tied to the euro, creating an artificially high exchange rate that benefits France. As you'd expect, this unequal dynamic makes these African countries extraordinarily financially dependent on the French government. And that dependence gets even worse when you consider how much aid and investment money France pumps into Africa. Which brings us to the next reason the French Empire is still alive: foreign aid. Now, on the surface, foreign aid should be a good thing. In fact, it is a good thing technically, but it's also a ridiculously useful tool for keeping countries under your control. And no one knows this better than France. In 2022 alone, France spent almost $16 billion in foreign developmental aid, with the overwhelming majority of that money going into former French colonies. Now, almost all of those countries are extremely poor, so it makes sense to give them more aid. But it also has the effect of tying further economic development to French money and investments. To give you an idea, 85% of French foreign aid goes to countries in Africa and the southern Mediterranean, with a vast bulk of the target countries being former French colonies. 14 of those nations even have French as their official language. So what's the problem? Shouldn't money getting invested into those poor countries help them out? Though this aid money is definitely helpful for building infrastructure and funding health and education projects, it comes with a big catch: debt. Much of the aid that France sends to developing nations is in the form of loans and credit lines. These investments are expected to be paid back and often accrue interest. But since the countries the foreign aid is going to tend to be extremely poor in the first place, they have very little ability to pay back their debt, and as a result, their national debt builds up. So they end up owing France an insane amount of money. On top of all this, there's also the territories that France does still have that make it more of an empire than it seems naturally. Let me explain. Once you zoom out of metropolitan France, you can see these small territories spread across the entire world. They make up what is part of overseas France. There's territories like Guadeloupe and Martinique located in the Caribbean, French Guiana in South America, Mayotte and Reunion in the Indian Ocean, and a further 8 more scattered around everywhere in between. Although they're all mostly small and barely populated, they're actually much more than just a few tiny islands. See, because of them, France is able to massively expand their Economic Exclusive Zone, or EEZ for short, to a point where they have the largest in the world, covering 4.5 million square miles of land. Just to put this into perspective, the EEZ of France covers approximately 9% of the total surface of the EEZs of the world, whereas the land area of the French Republic is only 0.45% of the total land area of Earth. This is a huge thing too, because a country's EEZ basically defines how much area of the sea you own, and all the natural resources that come with it. But all of this is overshadowed by a more obvious representation of France's modern empire, its military. Though certainly not what it used to be, the French military is still very powerful and has spread itself all over the globe. France maintains a huge military presence in Africa, and though many of these armed forces have been deployed as part of anti-terrorist campaigns, they nonetheless create a big power imbalance in France's sphere of influence. For example, French troops and airstrikes have propped up weak and unpopular governments in Mali, Burkina Faso, Chad, and Niger as part of Operation Barkhane, a military initiative to fight off Islamist militants in Africa. While some of these countries' governments have cooperated with the French military, others are extremely hesitant to allow French troops in their borders. Burkina Faso recently kicked all France's military forces out of the country because of how unpopular their armed presence is. And this is just one instance of recent attempts to push back against France's post-colonial influence by its former colonies. In developing countries that used to be ruled by France, increasingly popular public campaigns have been launched to eliminate French influence over these nations. The Economic Community of the West African States have even announced a proposed common currency known as ECO to eventually gain monetary independence from France. All of these things have led to France trying to do damage control and improve diplomatic relationships with these countries. And it's not difficult to see why they're so invested in keeping all these ex-colonies under his government's influence. France receives massive benefits from maintaining a colonial relationship with these countries. You can see this in the French uranium mine in Niger that supplies roughly 25% of the EU's uranium, as well as countless gold mines, oil fields, and natural resource extraction sites under France's control all over Africa. So Macron did things like call French imperialism a crime against humanity in a speech he gave in Algeria, and he has also taken steps to reform the CFA franc. As part of these reforms, he has proposed measures like getting rid of the requirement for 70% of those countries' money to remain in French hands, along with renaming the currency to distance it from its colonial past. France is also starting to play a big role in preventing ecological damage in its territorial waters. Since the country has control over 4.2 million square miles in ocean territory, mainly in the South Pacific and Indian Oceans, it's been able to do things like protect endangered fish populations by creating massive marine reserves. But reforms like this might be a case of too little too late. Former colonies continue to drift away from France and toward new partnerships with the UK, China, and Russia. So what's in store for the future of the hidden French Empire? In short, it's unclear. France continues to exercise extreme control over its old colonial territories with monetary policy, foreign direct investment, and military aid. On the other hand, protests break out periodically in those countries, and France is increasingly losing its iron grip on their governments. If these trends continue, the future of France's secret empire may remain in jeopardy.